thank you for joining me today as we discuss face management theory. My name is Carrera Burris, and today I will be going over the development of face management theory, and then four key components of the theory that I discovered through a literature review. Then I'll go through the theory's strengths and weaknesses and a practical application of the theory. The concept of face was first developed in 1967 by Erving Goffman. Face is the concept of the persona of who people think they are and how they attempt to maintain this impression on others through their interpersonal communication. In 1987, Brown and Levinson continued on this concept of face by developing the idea of positive and negative face. Now, positive face is the value that people have in being liked and respected by others, while negative face is the value people have in making their own decisions, having the autonomy and the independence on their own. In 1998, the concept of face threats was then created by Wilson, Alleman, and Leatham, where they determined that face threats can occur in an interpersonal interaction through things like developing a bad reputation, a loss of respect for a person, or even intentionally or unintentionally embarrassing or humiliating others and therefore making an attack on their face. Then finally, the face negotiation theory was developed by Stella Ting Toomey, who wanted to go through and see how face is determined, mitigated, and even threatened across cultures. Now, there are four key characteristics of face management theory that I wanted to go over here. The key takeaway is that culture greatly influences this concept of face because it determines what constitutes a face threat and how people can create strategies for mitigating these face threats. Now, individualism and collectivism really discusses the way that people have a concern for three different types of face. There's the concern for self, the concern for other, and a mutual face. The concern for a self face is often found in individualistic cultures, such as the American culture, where we are concerned on how we are perceived by others. However, in collectivist cultures, there's a greater concern for also maintaining the face of the other person and maintaining the face of the relationship itself. Now, culture also influences the idea of independence versus interdependence in a relationship, and this is also known as the self-construal. This influences how people see themselves and how they should interact with others. Now, cultures that have a more independent self-construal, again, similar to an American culture, we really value speaking our true feelings, being original, being ourselves, and we more value making sure that we are who we are instead of valuing the face of the other person or of the relationship. However, in more interdependent cultures, such as many Asian cultures, there is a perceived face threat for both parties, and so people really work in these interdependent relationships to make sure that they maintain the face for self, for other, and that mutual sense of face for the relationship. Now, depending on the type of relationship, people may communicate differently with one another. For example, the way we talk to our significant other may be different than how we speak to our parents or to our coworkers. Therefore, depending on the type of the relationship, there are some relational constraints that do exist in interpersonal communication. And it can be difficult in engaging in interpersonal conversation because there are so many factors that may constitute a face threat. For example, complaints, criticisms, making a request, or making a demand can all have a negative impact and threaten the other person's face depending on the relationship and depending on how our culture determines what is acceptable and what is not acceptable behavior. Now, all three of these topics, individualism and collectivism, self-construal, and relational constraints, are all interrelated and can tie together to create what is called a face threat if it is not appropriately handled. Now, there's a great cultural influence in face threat, but these face threats can also be mitigated, determined on the cultural values of power distances, the hierarchical relationship, or different interpersonal rules on what is acceptable or unacceptable behavior. One of the greatest ways that we find in this literature review to create a face threat is through a complaint. Now, there are two different types of complaints. We have a relational complaint and a dispositional complaint. Dispositional complaints may cause more concern to face because it is a direct complaint about the other person, some sort of characteristic that you don't agree with or that you don't like, which can directly attack that person's face. Relational complaints are more concerned with the general dissatisfaction that a person feels in the relationship. It may not necessarily attack the other person personally for their face, but may attack or threaten the face of the relationship. However, there are three different ways that people can mitigate these face threats. The first is through preventative face threat mitigation techniques, which is where the person can avoid or minimize the threat by engaging in face-saving behaviors, such as kind of sugarcoating maybe what they're going to say to the other person and not being as harsh in their delivery of that necessary face threat. Supportive face threat mitigation techniques can reinforce the other person's face through certain speech acts. So while you may have created that face threat through a speech act in and of itself, you can further reinforce their face in other ways. Finally, corrective face threat mitigation techniques are most common in intercultural conflicts or conversations because it ensures that the other person understands the message that you are sending to prevent any miscommunication or unnecessary face threats. Now, the reason why face management theory is so effective is because it describes interpersonal interactions and conversations and can be applied cross-culturally. Face is a universally cultural concept. It's found in every culture, and it can help explain and therefore create solutions to interpersonal conflicts by understanding what caused the conflict in the first place, understanding things like face threats, how they're created, but also how they can be mitigated. However, the difficulty, one of the greatest weaknesses of the face management theory is the fact that face threats are only studied in relation to certain speech acts of requesting, inviting, or complimenting. However, there may be other speech acts cross-culturally that could determine a face threat, but these have not yet been studied, so we cannot create mitigation techniques for what we do not know currently exists. So future research in this theory should work to see what are other ways and other speech acts that could potentially create a face threat, and how can we mitigate those as well. Now, the reason why I personally was so intrigued by face management theory is because it has a practical application, again, as I said, cross-culturally, but I want to hit on a key point that just because we consider this to be like a cross-cultural interpersonal conversation doesn't mean it has to necessarily be a cross-national or international conversation. I myself, coming from a military background, work in a very culturally diverse work environment. Even just what we have in the United States alone, in our own country, we have various cultures. So for example, I myself, coming from the West Coast, communicate very differently than my peers from New York or let's say from the South or from the Midwest may communicate. Now, I am from California, so for my peers, if I'm going to come and ask a favor or make a request in the workplace, I typically will go through and ask how their day is, how are they doing. I make some small talk before I just jump right in and ask for the favor. However, my peers who are from the East Coast are more what we might consider from California to be abrasive, will not waste time on small talk and instead just go in and make the request. Another concept is complimenting, in which some of my peers from the South will give a lot of compliments, and people from the Midwest, for example, may not know how to handle that or how to deal with it. And so it's just really important in understanding how we communicate with others, how we can work on maintaining our own face and the face of others to work out any face threats, mitigate these threats, and how we can all create a better work environment. Thank you all so much for listening. If you have any questions, please comment below. Thank you.